we're going to look very briefly at this concept of problem solving and what it means in psychology, how we deal with problems that we face in our everyday life, what those types of problems are, and techniques and strategies we use to solve them, and also some hiccups that we run into along the way due to our mental state. So, first, problem solving is in essence the removal of one or more impediments and finding the solution to a given situation. So, you have a situation and you have to figure out how you're going to resolve it. So, how am I going to get the money I need to buy a house? How am I going to get the grades I need to get in the college I want? How am I going to get across the river using this raft? Right? Those sorts of things. And so, when we problem solve, we try to answer those questions. And problems can either be well structured, like basic math problems. I need to figure out the square footage of this room. That's a well structured problem. It's pretty straightforward. Or it can be unstructured and kind of no single path to a solution, any variety of ways you can get there. For example, how can I be successful in school? Well, what successful means to a number of different people varies, and also how you can be successful varies from person to person. So they're structured and unstructured, and so these various types of problems have different types of solutions and how we deal with them. So to solve problems, we have to determine if it has one or more solutions. If there are multiple solutions, we use a process called divergent thinking, which requires creative thinking in order to come up with as many possible solutions as we can, and then determine from those solutions, from those possible solutions, which one we believe is the best possible solution to solve our problem, and why. So an example of divergent thinking is brainstorming. When you brainstorm, you are coming up with many different solutions or many different ideas, and then you choose the one that you think is best. If the problem can only be solved with one answer, then we use something called convergent thinking, where we converge to one answer, and it requires the narrowing of the choices available to determine which is the one answer or one choice which can get us the answer that we need. So those are two different ways of thinking: divergent and convergent thinking. Once we are working to solve a problem, we often use what are called heuristics, and those are rules of thumbs, intuitive rules of thumbs that help us, or maybe not, depending on the situation. So in any given situation, we have rules of thumbs that we try to use. A number of them will help. Sometimes it will lead us to incorrect conclusions. So, some examples of these heuristics, and again, they're just kind of rules of thumbs that we use to help us guide us in our decision making and problem solving. One is availability heuristic, and the availability heuristic is it's the rule of thumb where we judge what events come readily to mind. So, the example of that is many people seem to perceive flying as being more dangerous than driving a car. And the reality is the opposite of that. That driving a car is significantly more dangerous than driving. But because of our availability heuristic, many people tend to believe that airplanes are more dangerous because airplane crashes are so vivid and repeatedly reported. When there's an airplane crash, it dominates the news coverage and it embeds itself in our mind. So it is the thing that comes more easily to our mind. And so that's a problem, because it can lead us to an incorrect solution to whatever problem we're trying to solve. So that's availability heuristic, is whatever comes easiest to mind. And sometimes that's right, and sometimes that's wrong. Another example is representativeness heuristic, and that can also sometimes lead to incorrect conclusions. Basically, it's stereotyping, right? It's when we judge events and objects based off how much they align with a prototype of that event or object. So it's stereotyping. So, for an example, oftentimes athletes are viewed as less intelligent, even though, as we all know, athletes are required to maintain certain grade point averages in order to compete, at least at a high school and college level. And so, someone's particular view of an athlete will affect whether or not that representativeness heuristic is a correct or incorrect conclusion, right? So if we stereotype athletes as being less intelligent, and then we encounter an athlete who is less intelligent, then we would or people would pat themselves on the back as that heuristic being correct. But the reality is what we've done is stereotyped and perpetuated things like racism and sexism and ageism and all the other sorts of intolerance because of these wrong conclusions. And that's not just related to people, but also to items. If we run some sort of simulation, we have expectations for what those results will look like based off other prototypes we may have. In contrast to heuristics, which are kind of like off the top of your head, kind of random things that come to mind as rules of thumbs, there are things called algorithms. And algorithms are systemic and they're mechanical approaches to a problem, to a singular problem that has a singular answer, that guarantee an answer to a problem. Heuristics don't guarantee an answer to a problem. Algorithms do, if used properly. They're useful for only a small range of problems that we face because there's only a finite amount of questions or problems that we face that have a single answer. So they're not always useful, but they can certainly be helpful for certain problems that we face. Another thing when we're trying to solve problems is this concept of insight, which is helpful. When you're faced with a problem, insight is the term we use when we refer to this kind of sudden understanding of a problem, or if you don't understand the problem, you understand a new way of tackling or approaching the problem to solve it. And so that is insight. It usually requires us to think of the problem in a new way, and oftentimes it requires, when people are able to take a step back from the problem, to create mental or physical spacing between themselves and their problems in order to create distance and to kind of have reflection. This is a chance for you to, we often talk about, hey, when you're faced with a problem, take a step back and see if you can approach it from a different angle. That is how you gain insight into that problem. And then the last thing that we'll look at are the obstacles that we often face when we are problem solving. And the first thing is that we have a mental state. We come into every problem as individual human beings with essentially a ton of baggage that we've got to deal with. And that baggage really characterizes how we see problems, how we perceive problems, and how we attack problems. So we have a fixed frame of mind and a fixed frame of reference when we come into these events, and that can change and affect how we are able to deal with the problem. An example of this is something called functional fixedness, which is a tendency to assume a certain item is only useful for a task for which it's designed. For example, a wrench. You may think it's only useful for pulling out nuts or bolts. The reality is, if you turn it on its side, you could also use it as a hammer. You could throw it to use it to retrieve something. You could use it to scratch your leg. It could be useful for any number of different things. You could use it as a brace or support mechanism, but we tend to think of it as being a wrench, only usable for one item. So that is what we talk about when we say that we have a mental set or fixed frames. In order to break that, it often requires something called creativity, which is thinking, essentially that concept of thinking outside the box. But it's a process of producing something that is novel and worthwhile. So it's something that is unique, but also meaningful and worthwhile. We can't just create unique stuff that's useless. It has to also be worthwhile. And so that makes it kind of it's a difficult thing to kind of nail down. But the creativity is required to get past this fixed frame or mental set. Other things that can kind of hurt us in our problem solving, because they take away our objectivity, is confirmation bias, where we search for information that supports a particular view. Hindsight bias, where we tend to think that we knew, of course, all along with I knew what that would be, right? Where we knew all along what the outcome would be, even though we didn't. And then belief perseverance, where you see evidence that supports, you only see evidence that supports a particular position, despite all the evidence that is to the contrary of that. So even though there's overwhelming evidence for this conclusion, you still want to see only the evidence that points to the other potential conclusion, even if it's weaker evidence. And then the last thing is that framing, which is the way in which a question is asked, can definitely alter the outcome. And you should notice that all of these sorts of things are not just problem solving, but they also show up in terms of how we deal with studies and how we deal with research and how we deal with questioning each other and subjects that we may be encountering in psychology.